Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sarah Cott, Senior Vice President of Programming at The Hill. Thank you all for joining us in person this morning, and thank you to everyone joining us online for our event, Prescribing PBM Reform, Accelerating Transparency with Bipartisan Action. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Transparency RX, for their support of this discussion. We are here today to discuss pharmacy benefit manager reform. Just days after the White House convened a roundtable on this very topic, PBM reform has emerged as a bipartisan issue in a divided Congress. However, the issue did not make the cut in the most recent government funding bills, as some has hoped. With so many complex ideas and possible solutions on the table, how and when should Washington increase PBM accountability to make sure employees and patients aren't overpaying for their prescription medications they need? And what role will transparent PBMs, alongside all stakeholders in healthcare, play in driving that change? Before we get underway, a few housekeeping rules. If you're in the audience, if you could please turn your cell phones to silent, and you're welcome to join us on social media at The Hill events using the hashtag HillHealth. And with that, I am delighted to welcome Bob Cusack, The Hill's editor-in-chief, to the stage. He will be moderating our first interview with Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, co-sponsor of Protecting Patients Against PBM Abuse Act. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah, and good morning to everyone. Thanks for coming as we're live streaming on thehill.com. Big night last night, Congressman. I want to get kind of news of the day. What was your reaction to the results? We were talking earlier, not a huge surprise, but what was your take?
Biggest takeaway is Trump has if we think about this as Super Tuesday is the last date before which both President Biden and former President Trump are rallying their bases before heading into a general election. In that rallying of the bases, Trump has a much bigger problem than Biden does. There is no never Biden cohort within the Democratic electorate. There is a never Trump cohort within the Republican electorate. And while that never Trump cohort is relatively small, it is persistent. And it is, I think, unpersuadable to come back to him. So the math is much more in favor of Joe Biden than in Donald Trump right now.
Are you confident we're going to avoid having a government shutdown? As you know, Congress has punted and punted and punted, and now it seems like it's closer than ever to actually get bills enacted that are not just punts.
I don't use the word confident in the 118th Congress. I don't know if how many of you have met our speaker, but he does not inspire confidence. He is just totally a deer in the headlights and doesn't have control over his conference. He's obviously relying really on a de facto governing coalition of both parties, but he refuses to admit it or to actually operationalize it and turn it into an asset rather than a liability. And so everything is going to be careening from, his failures to make decisions on big items. So I'm not confident on anything. Yeah, there's a deal in place, but let's get it to the president's desk.
You've been a leader in attempting to lower prescription drug costs and PBM reform. How did you get involved in this issue?
So I represent Massachusetts, which is the life sciences capital of the world. And I grew up in a family of scientists. My mom was a pioneering cancer researcher, grandfather, dad, brother, stepfather, all of them involved in research. And one thing that's made me appreciate is that the quality of the science is more exciting right now than it's ever been. Everyone talks about AI and the potency of AI to transform our world. I actually think relative to AI, CRISPR and gene editing and our understanding of biology and our ability to turn biology into an engineerable discipline is more exciting as a general purpose technology than AI is. 50 years from now, we'll be reflecting on biotech as actually more of a game changer than artificial intelligence. And obviously there's confluence between the two. But I have tremendous respect for biomedical research and development, but my frustration has been that there is this chasm between how exciting the science is and the patient experience of that and patient access to the fruits of those discoveries. And as you dig into why that is, before long, you stumble on PBM reform.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of which, PBM reform was not included, as you know, in certainly the first set of funding bills. lawmakers who really want to get this done this year, including Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden, very disappointed in that, pointing to the lame duck. Is the possibility in the lame duck, or could it be done beforehand?
It could be done in the lame duck. It could be done beforehand. Some of those decisions are happening in rooms, frankly, that I'm not invited to. I would go back, though, to my statement about the 118th Congress, and I would just have a baseline expectation that it's going to be very hard to pass policy in the 118th Congress, where we've got an incompetent speaker going into an election year, or in an election year going into an election. My view on a lot of this is, yeah, be ready for whatever legislative vehicle comes, and we're working on PBM legislation and trying to build a cross-sectional coalition behind it in the House Democratic Caucus and with bipartisan support as well. But I am also oriented to next Congress and ACA tax credits and other potential vehicles to move reform on. I just think it's very unwieldy right now. I mean, look at the tax bill that we passed in the House, right? Big bipartisan majorities for that tax bill.
Right.
And kind of deflated in the Senate. So there's just, mechanically, it's just very challenging right now.
But also, there's literally dozens of PBM reform measures that are pending. And what is going to be the vehicle in the end all? Because this is a bipartisan bill, yeah. Both in the House and the Senate. But what is the bill that's going to move? Because you're a co-sponsor of many of them.
So what I've learned in 3 years in Washington is that the who and the what of policymaking is hard but relatively straightforward, meaning figuring out what kind of policy you want to do and the coalition to build around it is kind of mechanical. You plow through it. Figuring out the when is the fruit of decades of experience on the Hill. And so you're asking me the when, and the candid answer is I don't know. And it's going to require people like Richie Neal and Hakeem Jeffries and Senator Wyden, I think, to get aligned on how to move it. The clear horse in the stable that has to go around the track, though, is the ACA tax credits next year.
Right.
That is a clear Democratic health care priority, and things that get attached to that, I think, have the best chance of flying.
So now in this Congress, PBM reform definitely made some significant strides. As you say, remains to be seen whether it's going to get done. Probably not before the election, maybe in the lame duck. But you think that one way or the other, next year, when you have a lot of, whether it's expiring tax credits, I mean, you have the vehicles there, you think it'll get done at least sometime next year?
At this point, when you've got legislation that is vetted, bipartisan, and at least elements of it are saving money, it's hard to me to see how that sits on the table for too long. At some point, there's a package where that gets picked up and added onto it. I do have confidence that we are doing PBM reform legislation in the next term or two. It's also worth, though, taking a step back and just, because PBM reform is a very, very big term, right? There's a lot of things that go in there. And when we say PBM reform, obviously the devil's in the details. Like, what are the things that we're really talking about? To me, the absolute keystone policy within that is going to be delinking both in the Medicare and in the commercial markets. There's a lot of other elements in there, spread pricing and steering and DIR reform and benefits consultants, and there's a lot of elements. But the very, very core of it, and I think probably the thread that has to be pulled on and gotten alignment around first, is that delinking element. And that was probably the biggest challenge, I think, in these PBM reform negotiations this last month.
Now critics of PBM reform legislation say, well, if you make those changes, and it is nuanced, it's complicated, but that it could be whack-a-mole where PBMs could raise administrative costs. So if you're getting rid of the delink part, other issues could pop up. And someone's celebrating early for PBM reform. But what about that criticism? As you know, this has been an intense lobbying battle. The pharmaceutical industry very involved, obviously the large PBMs involved.
Yeah, and this is going to be the big stick the PCMA and others are going to swing, which is, hey, wait a minute, you make us change, rebate pass-through, or you make us change spread pricing or steering, and we're going to have to raise premiums. Right. And I want to give two answers to that maybe even three answers to that. One is, I think we need to empirically demonstrate counterfactuals and go out there to, Troy Medicare in North Carolina or Scan Insurance in California and be like, I'm looking at examples right now of companies that have 0 deductibles, 0 copays, and they're not raising premiums. So, onus is on you, Fortune 10 company, to explain to us why that is true for you. The second answer is political, which is to say, I would love to get into a debate with United Healthcare as a politician about whether my attempts to lower out-of-pocket costs for patients by eating into some of their $7 billion of quarterly profit is more popular than their attempts to raise premiums on Medicare Part D beneficiaries because we're forcing them to be more transparent. Let's have that fight. Democrats had that fight during the ACA with the health insurance companies. We won. One of the biggest accomplishments of the last 20 years was the ACA, and we took on the corporate greed of the health insurance companies to do it. We should be begging to get into that debate with United Healthcare. I walk into town halls throughout my district, and I lay this directly on the table. This is a winning issue, and I think we should welcome this attempt, this opportunity to show the American people that we are fighting integrated monopoly power to lower prices for them.
What about the claim, hey, the PBM reform is really just distracting from the profits of the pharmaceutical industry? In this country, we have healthcare for profit. Some people don't like it, but that's the way it is. What about that, and obviously the effect of the Inflation Reduction Act, which the pharmaceutical industry was not fond of? Do they assume some responsibility here too?
Definitely, and the pharmaceutical companies need to drop these lawsuits against the IRA. Frankly, the judges are kind of making them look silly right now by dismissing a lot of their claims out of hand, and I think these pharmaceutical manufacturers, if they want to be able to work in good faith with members of Congress in both parties on concerns that they have, suing CMS is not a great way to start that conversation. There's nothing unconstitutional about Medicare as a buyer, exerting their leverage as a buyer. I think their First Amendment and Fifth Amendment claims are just really, to me, they're not cutting it. Mm-hmm. But to answer that question more foundationally, I do think it's worth taking a step back and thinking to ourselves, how do we want the drug industry to work? It's very easy as a politician to criticize how things are working now, and I certainly am willing to do that. But I also, I think, have the onus of presenting what do I want the world to look like? And the way I view it in my head is, in a functioning drug pricing marketplace, you have in the foreground the patient, the pharmacist, and the scientist. And the scientists are competing for the very best biomedical advances that treat both chronic and acute conditions for the patient. And they are ferociously competing amongst themselves for who can get that drug to market under the strict auspices of the FDA. And there's healthy competition there. And these pharmaceutical companies are evaluated based on the quality of their R&D. On the other side, you get the pharmacists. And the pharmacists are competing to provide high-quality services to patients in the dispensation of these drugs. It's not just kind of moving pills from one bottle to another. It is being true community pharmacists, where they're able to provide consultation and care to patients. And patients are going to vote with their feet about which kind of pharmacist is providing that kind of service. That's the way I want things to work, where the patient is at the center and you've got pharmacists and scientists competing in a market system to deliver the best both cures and care to that patient. The way it works now, though, is really the insurance companies are in the foreground. And through steering and through networks and through the fact that list prices feed so much downstream revenue for hospitals and for plan sponsors, the PBMs are the ones who are in the foreground and who basically have a command and control view of the market. And that is what we have to break. And the way to break that, it's multifaceted, but the core of it is, I think, going to be delinking.
The White House this week had a listening session on this issue. Would you like to see this mentioned in the State of the Union? Do you like to see the White House really take this and say, hey, we can get this done this year as opposed to next?
Yeah, although I don't want the president to commit to things that he's totally dependent on Congress to do, okay. Right? So I want to be cautious of his political capital. I think the president probably needs to focus his State of the Union on telling the story of what's already happened with costs stabilizing and, in fact, real wages going up over the last year and a half, and also putting his hand out again to Republicans to say, come fix the border with me. and letting them again say, no, we want to campaign on the border, not govern on the border. I think that's probably got to be where the focus of his State of the Union is at. To the extent that he's talking about drug pricing, frankly, thinking politically again, I would just remind voters what he's already done. The last time I checked, fewer than half of Americans actually knew that we empowered Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Fewer than half of Americans were aware that their Part D costs are now capped at $3,500, going to $2,000 next year. Like, we don't have to make promises. We can literally just point to what we did.
But that's also a bit of a problem, because with any healthcare legislation, including which I covered the creation of Part D, it took a couple years to set up. Same thing with the IRA. People are not quite seeing it. So how do you massage that message?
Well, people are going to see the $3,500.
That's true.
That's in effect this year, and particularly that cancer patients are going to benefit from that disproportionately, and I think there's a strong and potent story to tell about that. And then I think there's also, and this is not the most appealing feature of politics, but it just is true, that sometimes voters define things through the fights that are getting picked, and when they see pharma suing the administration, they may not know why the pharma is suing the administration, but they take that as a sign that somehow a fight is being picked on their behalf. And I think that the administration is doing this. They're going to use those lawsuits to their advantage. It's another reason I would tell pharma, like, strategically here, I'm not sure you're doing yourselves any favors.
Regarding savings and people watching this, we've got a lot of stakeholders in the room, kind of insiders like me, but a lot of people watching who just want their drugs reduced.
Yeah.
So how can we ensure with PBM reform that the savings are not going to be passed not to the consumer, but to somebody else?
Well, part of it is legislative. So in the legislation that some of it's already out there and some of it we're working on, there is mandatory pass-through of 100% of the rebates, right? And being very strict about the definitions of what counts as an admin fee versus what counts as a rebate, right? Because we all know what's going to happen is the PBM is going to say, all right, we won't do rebate pass-throughs. But it turns out that our admin fees are actually predicated on A, B, and C, and D, which have suspicious correlation with the list prices, right? So we have to be extremely rigorous in basically putting in statute the anti-kickback rule, right? Which is really like the fiduciary idea that PBM should have a flat, transparent rate and not be linked to list prices. Because right now we have a situation where higher list prices feeds a lot of downstream entities.
And as far as people who are pushing for this bill to pass, whether it's this year or next, what do you encourage them to do, constituents or otherwise?
Talk to CBO. The biggest thing that we've got to work on is we need the Congressional Budget Office to have a more nuanced appreciation for what a fully, the marketplace that I described, where you have scientists and pharmacists competing to provide cures and services to patients. CBO needs to more holistically internalize the benefits of that in how they score things, because so much of this is really not even going to come down to politics, because largely the politics is there. There's bipartisan support for a lot of this. It's going to come down to how to pair up offsets and expenditures. And until CBO starts giving scores back that reflect what I think are really the long-term savings of a better functioning drug pricing marketplace, it's going to be hard to get this stuff across the line.
And that has been a problem with CBO that lawmakers have complained about for a while.
Yeah, but we see the CBO now thinking, I think, more progressively about a lot of issues. Immigration.
You've seen some change recently.
CBO is certainly assertively going out there and saying, help us think differently about these things. We're seeing it with immigration. We're seeing it with cell and gene therapies. We're seeing it even, I think, with the GLP-1 inhibitors, and like, what's the true offset going to be in terms of if you reduce the incidence of diabetes, right? So I think CBO, to their credit, they're rigorous, right? They want to see evidence.
Right.
So we're going to need some good peer-reviewed papers out there that show CBO, hey, this is actually, don't buy the PCMA argument that premiums go up and we all pay more. Look more deeply.
Mm-hmm. Not many things get over 300 votes in the House, whether it's the tax bill or PBM reform, but then it has to pass the Senate, doesn't it? And that can be frustrating.
It's got to pass the Senate, or it can go the other direction, right? And Senator Wyden can tell you something can pass unanimously in finance and be a very well-vetted bill, and then kind of fall apart in the four corners.
Right, just get stuck. Well, Congressman, thanks for joining us this morning. Please thank the Congressman for joining us. Thank you so much.